In this video we're going to look at importing your register into the CRS. There's a couple of other videos that you may want to look at before you start to import your register for the first time. One is on producing mapping filters, which is something that you need to do once for your register if you're going to import it. There's a video that covers that in some detail, so we're not going to go into that in this video. The other one you might want to look at is dealing with journal titles that don't match up with titles currently in the authority list, because that's something that will come up as you import records into the CRS, and dealing with that is outside the scope of this video. So have a look at both of those. They're both quite short, but you really should familiarize yourself with those before you start to import. We're going to import a bunch of records from a ProSite register into the CRS. There's several different options for reading records in from different types of legacy data. This example is to do with ProSite. You can also read in records from EndNote or Reference Manager. You can read in records from a comma delimited file, or from an Excel file, or from Meerkat. And the routine for getting the records in is broadly the same for each of them. There's a few minor differences, but they're explained in the help file. So for this example, we're going to use a ProSite export file. The first thing you need to do is to get your data out of your legacy system, and again there's instructions on how to do that in the help file. It's important that you export it in the correct way so that we get all the fields coming into the CRS properly mapped and in the proper format. So we've exported from ProSite. We've got the text in a text file, so we're going to read it in. We already have an import filter because we've done this process before. So we're not going to look at the import filter in any detail in this example. We're just going to untick this box here so we can have a quick look at it, just to show you what it is that you would be expecting if you hadn't already created an import filter. So the first thing it does is to go through the data file and look at the fields that are in the data file and try and match them up with fields in the import filter, or if you haven't got an import filter, try and put them into categories so that you can create an import filter. So once it's done that, this is quite a big file. There are 8,500 records in this file, so it doesn't take that long to read it in. We can see, because we told it that we wanted to look, we can see that it's shown as the import filter. These are the fields that you will have mapped in when you created your filter, and these are the values within the record. We can see that for this data set there are 7 or so work forms in the original ProSite data file. We're bringing all of those in with a separate mapping, because in this particular example the fields that were associated with each of the different record types were very well specified in the original data. So we're going to try and maintain that as we bring it in to the CRS, so that we can use the record type mappings that were in the original data and bring those straight into the CRS. Okay, so if you didn't have a filter and you've looked at the create a filter video, then you will come to this screen and create your filter, save it for the first time, and then it's there for you to come back to. Okay, the next thing that's going to do is to go off and bring all the records into the holding area, ready to be brought into the CRS. Depending on the amount of data, this can be reasonably quick. There's 8,500 records coming through here, and you can see that the progress in real time is not bad. It's going to be a couple of minutes to bring this whole data set in. If you've got 40,000 records, then it can take a little bit longer, but most registers are not that big, so this part of the process is reasonably straightforward and reasonably quick. So we'll just let that finish and bring the records in, and then we can have a look and see what it's done when it's brought those records through. Okay, the first thing we see is a summary of what's happening. We can see that it's found 4,255 exact matching records. So what that means is that there's just over 4,000 records that we're bringing in from our specialized register that match exactly with records that we've already got in our data set. And those records would have come from Central or from Cochrane Reviews and Protocols if this is the first time that you've brought in your register. We can see with those exact matching records, it doesn't do anything. It just brings in any additional fields that you've got with those records, but it doesn't create any new records. It's found that there are 19 records that it regards as new. It's found that there are just over 4,000 close matching records and 79 possible matching records. And in this data set, we're not bringing in studies, so this is not a study-based register, so we haven't brought any studies in, so there is 0 on that set of counts there. Okay, so if we go into the records that we've brought in, and we can see where all of these records are matching up and what these figures mean. So let's go and have a look at the journal tab, because I think that one's the one that's most likely to give us information that's useful to us. So let's have a look at what we've got here. We've got 3 tabs. We've got one for new records, so that's telling us that these records have not been matched up to anything within the CRS, so they're being brought in as new. We can see that up here within the journals work form we've got 3,486 that are exact matches, so it's not going to show us those because they're exact matches. We're just going to bring those in. The 2 tabs that are probably the most useful to you are these 2, which is the close matching records and the possible matching records. And it's worthwhile just talking through what the options are on both of those tabs and what they mean, because how you deal with those determines how well your data gets imported into the CRS. Let's look at the close matching records first. So these records have gone into this tab because they're very close matches to existing records within the CRS. And by very close we mean that all bar one or all of the bibliographic fields have matched up. So if we look at these records, we can scan through them if we want to. There's 4,500 of them. I'm not sure that anybody would want to do that, but it might be useful for you to just have a look at the records in this tab from the outset so you can see what the differences are. We can go through and we can look at the fields that are different within the records, and what we can see is that where the records where the record highlight, where the field highlight is yellow, there's a difference between the fields. We can see that in this case there's a difference with the in-file value. There's a difference also with the year of publication, so that is something that we might want to think about. And we can see that for the other fields that we've got here, there's a lot of differences because we're not bringing those values in. Now, it's worthwhile just talking before we go any further about how the CRS determines which fields it's going to bring in from your records. So on this screen we have this value is the imported record, and it tells us here, and this value is the existing CRS record, which we also flag up as the central record, so we know that where that record's come from. The process that the CRS uses to determine which fields it's going to pick, and the fields that it's going to pick are the ones that are ticked, and if we scroll down a little bit we can see that mostly it's going to take imported record values, but in the case of year of publication it's going to take the one that's already in the central record. The way it makes those decisions, first of all, is to look at the global settings. So we know it's looking at the global settings because global settings is ticked, and we can go up here to the spanner and we can look at what those global settings are, and these are all set to on by default, and it's probably a good idea to leave them on unless you find that you're importing data that you don't necessarily want to import. So it's going to take a year field that contains a year and a month if it finds one. Well, that's exactly the example we've got here. We've got a year and a month in the existing record, and we're only importing a year. So it's going to bring in the field that contains the most data. So it's going to bring in a year and a month. You can also tell it to bring in a field that contains the most authors, and again that's set by default. So if you've got 3 authors in one field and 5 authors in a different in the existing record or in the other record, it will bring in the field that contains the most authors. You can tell it to bring in authors with accented characters. So if both fields contain the same authors, but one field doesn't have accents on the author names and the other one does have accents, then it'll bring in the one with accents. You can tell it to bring in a field that contains a value. That's quite a useful one. So if you have 2 records, one existing record and one record that you're bringing in, and there's a mixture of values, some fields are populated and some are not in both of those records, then having this option ticked will bring in any field that contains a value. And the other one that's allied to that is bringing in a field with the most content. So you can tell it by default if both fields are populated, so there's a field populated in the imported record and the same fields populated in the existing CRS record, then it'll bring in the field that contains the most content. So they're the default values and they'll be applied if you don't do anything else. You can override those. You can say, okay, no, actually, whatever the values of any of the records, I always want to bring in my imported fields. So that overrides the global fields and brings in all of the imported fields. Or you can say, no, actually, I don't want to bring in my fields because my data is not as good as the existing fields, so I'm going to bring in the existing CRS fields. So that's going to override the global defaults and bring in the CRS fields. There's another option which lets you determine on a field by field basis what fields are going to be brought in, and this is the preference fields. So if you click on preference fields and then open the fields dialog, you can see that you have all of the fields that are available in this listing, and for each of the fields you can choose to override the global defaults and take either the imported field value or the current field value. So you would use this, for example, if you always wanted to take the current field source, but you were not bothered about any of the other values. You were going to let the global values override those. So we'll say, okay, we're always going to take the global fields. We're always going to take the global fields, but we're always going to override the source field. So we're always going to take the field from the existing value, regardless of what the value in our imported record is. Okay, so it's worthwhile looking at those and playing with those values and just see how it affects the fields that are being brought in. The other thing that you need to think about on this screen is how you're going to bring all the records in. And this is quite important because if you get this wrong, you could end up with a large number of records that you don't necessarily want in your data set. You can go and find them afterwards with deduplication and remove them, but it's better to deal with them at this point. So what we want to do with close matching records, so records that we think in the vast majority of cases will be a match for an existing record, is that we want to overwrite all all of the matched records. So we want to say, yep, okay, these records match up, just merge them and bring them in. What we could do is to say import all records as new. And what that would do would say, regardless of whether they look as though they're matches or not, bring them into the CRS as a new record. That's not a good thing to do in general on this screen, although there are circumstances where you may want to do it. If you go through this list of records and you see a record that clearly isn't a match and should be brought in as a new record, for the individual records you just click Set as New, and that will take that record and move it into the New Records screen. So you can see it's being brought in as a new record over here. That count's gone up from 4 to 5. Okay, so for the close matching screen, the general rule of thumb, once you've had a look at the data, is that you'd expect there to be a lot of close matches. You'd hope there's a lot of close matches. You'd almost always want to overwrite the existing matched records, so bring in the data, and more often than not, the global settings will be the right settings to give you the best set of values that can be brought into the CRS. Okay, if we then go and look at the possible matching records, so these are the records where the fields, some of the bibliographic fields match up, but some of them don't match up. And that's where we probably need to spend more time looking at the records. In this example, we've got 79. Some of you may have more than that. Some of you may have fewer than that. And again, you have several options. The options are the same. So what you could do, if you didn't care what the records were being input, whether they matched up or not, was to just choose the defaults, which would be to use the global settings, which uses the ones that we talked about earlier, and to overwrite all the matched records. So you could say, yep, they all match, let's bring them in. Or if you don't have that many, then I know what a lot of groups are doing is actually just having a look at these records and just seeing if there's any pattern to what's being brought in and seeing why the values are different. So, for example, in this one, we can see that the PubMed ID is different, and we're going to get that by default anyway. We can go through and look at all the fields. We can see that cited in review is different, which is a field that we're bringing in. We can see that all of these fields are different here. But what we can also see is that the year of publication is different, although what we're going to do, of course, is bring in the one that contains the most data. Okay, so if you go through those records and choose the ones that you want to bring in, and bear in mind this is bringing in your register, so the first time you do this, and for many of you it will be the only time that you do it, it's an opportunity to do some data cleaning, to find some duplicates that are either already in your register or are duplicates of records that are in central that hadn't been picked up on. The next time you bring things in, importing from a file, then there's very much fewer records that you have to deal with. But for this first time, there may well be quite a few. The thing to look out for is if there's some of the figures don't look right. So, for example, if you're reading in your register and you know that all of your registers published in Central, and you see that it's giving you a very large number of new records or a very large number of possible matching records, then it's worthwhile stopping at that point and going back to the start, which you can do with this button here, and just looking at your mapping, because it's likely that one of the key fields in the bibliographic data is not being mapped correctly. So, for example, if you're not mapping author, then the records are never going to match up. So if you've got something that doesn't feel right or doesn't look right, don't just go ahead and read the data in, go back and check it. And if it still doesn't feel or look right, then contact CRS help at Cochrane.org, and somebody will pick the message up and help you work through whatever the problem is. Okay, the next step, which is the final step, is we're going to say import the records. You have an option at this point not to import all of the records that you've got in the data set. You may well want to save some of them and come back later, so you can choose to not import the web items, not import the conferences or any of the others. Or if you want to, you can just, if you're still not sure what's going on, you could just import the close matches or just import the possible matches. In general, you would have dealt with them all in one go, so you read them all in. Okay, so we let that go and import the records, and what that will do is take all of the records that were in the pending tray, which is what we've just been looking at, and read them into the CRS, at which point they become proper records. Any fields that need to be merged are merged. Any records that are new will be created as new. It's worthwhile when you've done that just going through and doing a manual deduplication, just to have a look at the data and see see if there's any records that have come in as duplicates that weren't picked up in that first deduplication that we've just gone through. But you don't need to do that. You can do that at some future point. There's a separate video on deduplication, and it's worthwhile having a look through that and just going and looking at your data. Okay, that's as far as we're going to go with this video. Do have a look at the others, and as always, if there are any problems, then please contact CRS help at Cochrane.org.